Good morning, one and all. It's so fantastic to see you here today, and thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to welcome everybody here, and then Mark Roberts is going to do a welcome to country for us, and Aidan Ricketts, who's an author, activist, who we all know from Southern Cross University, and from his absolute advocacy for direct action and doing something for social change, which is what today's all about. I just want to do a very short introduction to say that what happened with the Aquarius Festival was quite unique. First of all, they had the slogan, "You are the festival." So everyone had to bring what they could to the festival. There wasn't a program. And so that created something of people taking charge for themselves and for each other and for the community. And that has lasted for the last 50 years as far as I can see. And a lot of people stayed on after the festival and really built some extraordinary things have happened in Nimbin over the last 50 years, of which we can be incredibly proud and grateful. And we can continue to do that because we want young people to keep coming here. We want our town to be kind and generous and supportive, and for housing to be available and affordable. And so that's what today's about. Getting to that point and how do we do it and how we can take charge of that ourselves. So without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Aidan Ricketts so that he can introduce Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. It's like a chain of introductions, isn't it? So necessarily we'll begin with welcome to country. So thanks, Mark Roberts, for welcoming us, and something we welcome ourselves, unlike some people in Australia. Thank you.
Bullabay. Jingiwalla. Welcome everybody. Welcome to country. You'll have to just bear with me. Not the best at this. Now, yes, we are in a very lovely piece of country here. And in the Bundjalung tribe, Nimbin is a very special place. With Nimbin Rocks was the initiation place for all of the Bundjalung people, men, boys going to be becoming men. And when we see Nimbin Rocks, it reminds us of our lineage, you know. It always brings back memories of who we are, what we're here for, things like that. And so we are very lucky here in this part of the world. And I'd just like to pay tribute and a bit of respect to Uncle Lyle Roberts Jr., who did the first Aquarius Welcome to Country. Apparently it was a very powerful welcome in language and storytelling and dances. Pay tribute and respect to other Aboriginal people that have been involved in low-cost housing out here in Nimbin. And so that's one thing that a lot of Aboriginals like to be involved with is, of course, low-cost housing. So, you know, of course. And so just to finish up, I just want to say, you know, for the past, the present and the future knowledge keepers, elders, we would like to just welcome you to the Bundjalung tribe, and not only the Bundjalung tribe, to the clan, the Widjabawayable clan of the Bundjalung tribe, which is where we are. So Thanks very much, guys, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for your beautiful welcome and for all of the years we've collectively been able to enjoy, you know, the benefits of living in this beautiful country. And, you know, one of the beautiful things about a lot of the people here is that I think at least we've been able to hear some sort of voice from country which has helped propel us to say, gee, we need to save those forests, we need to stop that land being fracked. You know, it is beautiful to sometimes look out and go, well, we heard some voice and we did something about it, and we've protected it from something. Okay, and you know, to me, I think in so many ways it's that protection of country and that protection of the environment, which is always my first love. Somehow more recently I've come around, you know, to also being active for the humans and the housing and so on, and that's probably because, you know, there's the environment and there's justice, and you know, they're just two things that, you know, if you've really got a switched on soul and your eyes are open, you can't resist either of those. So that's how we're here. Thank you. All right, I think I've got to introduce the speakers, but I'll do that at the end, and I'll just have a little bit of a chat, sort of framing our discussion for today. I mean, really this housing crisis that we live in is it's a horrifying thing. It's an intergenerational crime, for one thing. I think it's very sad how much it's really splitting the generations. You know, young people really feeling ripped off by it, and rightly so. And so it's sort of interesting to sort of think, how did we get here? And it's sort of fitting when we're thinking about Aquarius and thinking about the 70s to think about the kind of society we had then. And sort of sadly, you know, I mean, capitalism is always the problem that it is. Democracy is the attempt to do something about it that it is. And perhaps in the 70s we got perhaps as close as we got to at least sort of regulating capitalism in a mildly redistributive way, you know, particularly by the time we got to the Whitlam government. But even before that, you know, the wartime and post-war governments of Curtin and Chifley, the establishment of things like the Housing Commission. You know, when I grew up as a kid, in the 70s, you know, Housing Commission was a massive thing. Well, at least it was for me. My family lived nearby. We were working class, but not in Housing Commission. But, you know, I went to school, and, you know, most of the school kids I knew were in Housing Commission. It was just, it covered vast amounts of every city, and I think we're all aware of it. I mean, sometimes it was kind of sometimes seen as a slightly derogatory term, but we look on it now and go, wow, it's not that. It's not that at all. It's what society should have been doing. And, you know, even for 23 years of Liberal government in those days, it was still maintained as a very strong policy. So how did we get to where we are? And, you know, and I think that's the horror, really, that we went from the idea that government is there to tax the rich and spend to provide the goods for society, and housing sort of being one of those absolute ones, absolutely foundational ones, you know, to the degraded society we're in now. I use the term the dismal tide of neoliberalism, because I really think that's where it is. It's an absolutely dismal tide. You know, as someone employed at the university with an actual reasonable wage, every time John Howard and his following cronies would give out those ridiculous pre-election tax cuts, you know, I'd always just despair, going, look, I don't want $10 more a week, I want a fair society, you know. But it goes beyond that. I mean, even the entire tax system only taxes people who actually exert themselves and work. It doesn't tax people sufficiently who sit in their arse and just collect the money. Landlords in Australia pay net negative tax, which is just absolutely appalling. You know, with all of the rorts, the negative gearing and you know, the capital gains tax rorts and so on that were again set up by the Howard government mostly. They pay net negative tax, so they're actually withdrawing from the tax system whilst cashing in on it. It's so, you know, that's where I really see the problem. Or so much of the problem is just that system, and it was, you know, it was set up open-eyed as an intergenerational bribe. I mean, I remember watching an intergenerational report came out way back in, you know, the early part of the new century or the late 90s, and the government was so aware of the problem of the ageing population, and yet at the same time were bribing them with all of all of these rorts and so on for property just to keep the Liberal Party in power. And it's and we all know it's not as though the Labor Party's faultless with all of this, but I guess they did run an anti-negative gearing policy to an election and lost it, so they've lost their nerve a bit on that. So one of the themes that really frames the housing crisis, as bad as it's got, is that idea of just this dismal tide of neoliberalism and the awful way in which homes have become just commodities and assets rather than homes. And another way we really see that, and it's and it's visual, is all homes in Australia nowadays are white on the inside. That's just about it. Colour has been absolutely drained, and there's one reason why all interior decorating has gone white, because nobody thinks this is well, they might around here, but very few people in the cities, for example, think this is my family home forever and we're going to do it up the way we want. Nearly everybody's like, oh, it's an asset, we've got to paint it in neutral colours so it's going to have a good resale value. And so people have observed, there's actually, and it's almost symbolic, this idea that we've so lost the concept of what a home is spiritually and emotionally and turned it into an asset that we can't even paint it. We can't even let our kids paint their wall ghastly purple, right? Which is they're always wanting to do, So, we can't even have that incredibly personalised tile mosaic in our kitchen because, oh my good, the purchasers might not like it. So it's become awful. But I think that's one thing. And in terms of that intergenerational crime, it's just awful what young people are facing. I remember once, I was only in high school, I don't know why these things were in my mind, but using the silly idea of the stork bringing babies, I remember just drawing this little cartoon when I was about 15 of the planet, so I must have seen the photos from space, and the stork coming in with a new baby and just a little sign poking out of the North Pole that just says keep off private property. Because private property's never really made sense on this planet, actually. We take it so for granted. But what does it really mean? It really is an insult to every new baby born. It says, welcome to the planet, now go to work and try and buy a bit of it. And you never really get to buy a bit of it. You buy a bit of it, you mortgage it to the bank, and then these days people end up remortgaging it back to the exploitative aged care industry because their families aren't looking after them, and it's awful. So that's one whole side of it, that dismal tide of neoliberalism that's broken our lives up. So if one thing I think we can begin to do inside ourselves is that emotional and spiritual change where we start to look at homes differently, look at families differently, and look at our lives differently, and not be infected by that ideology of dismal neoliberalism. The second really big one, I think, that really enforces the homelessness problem is the complexity of the planning system. And it's really, and it's coupled to the first one, I think, because it's really saddening that we move more and more and more towards this planning system in which houses have to be done up like wedding cakes with their smoke alarms and this and that and planning standards, and it's, people don't build new homes because it's just too hard. I mean, I'm lucky to have, owner built one out at Kyogle, and they sent me the occupation certificate in the mail without ever sending around a building inspector, And that was in 2004, but that's Kyogle. But these things, it's like a noose that tightens and tightens and tightens and tightens, and nobody, it's just too hard to go ahead and build houses unless you don't tell anyone that you're doing it. And I think there's something awful there too, because it's a two-stage process where on the one hand we've got this bureaucratic and collective vision of housing standards and how incredible, how just the first world housing standard that you have to reach and all of the regulations you have to get through. And then on the other hand, the fact that they're just absolutely unaffordable and people can't get them, they can't rent them, they can't build them, they can't make any. And so I kind of see that, we've got to, as a society, we either, if we want to have housing standards that high, then we would need to invest in building houses like the Housing Commission did all those years ago that make that accessible to people at that standard. But if we're going to say, what I say is the planning system's really become a gatekeeper. It's like a gated suburb. Oh, if you can afford the massive rental or if you can afford the massive mortgage, you can go into the gated community of these supposedly safe homes. They're built of garbage materials anyway, but leave that aside. And the rest of you are, somehow scrabbling around, being told that being told it's your fault, being told that you should be ashamed, you should be invisible, as they do to the homeless. And so it just becomes this two-part society, whereas, I've lived in Vanuatu, you go to other societies that actually don't have the same supposed on-paper standard of living, but at least they don't make it illegal to be poor. At least they don't make it illegal to build a shack and live in it. Because, I think what everybody who's lived in the hills and built their own shack knows is that you find dignity, you find joy in every day living in a 1 or 2 room shack with a garden out the back of it that you've built yourself that you can live in. Whereas you don't find joy sitting on a rental list, sitting on a public housing list, waiting for the government to finally find you some, scummy little flat that apparently has running water and electricity. You'd be much happier lighting up your chip heater and sitting in your bath under the stars than doing that. And I think that's, again, something that we've proven around here. So yeah, they're the things I see as a real problem, and that's why this region, that's why the Aquarian history and the multiple occupancy history has been so absolutely important, because it actually turned around and said, no, we're going to actually enable that. We're going to allow people to move out in the hills. We're going to enable them to break down the individualism of neoliberal society and cooperate with each other and buy land collectively. We're going to enable them to build their own unique houses, which are small, which don't necessarily have mains power, which don't have all those things. Personally, I lived for 9 years, I think, without refrigeration or hot water, but I'd never do it again. If I ever start again, it's roof, water tank, hot water system, and then we can build the rest of it. But you can't try to build all day and then not have a hot bath to sit in. But anyway, that's just me getting old. So, we've really done that. And I think one of the really big themes that made that all possible, and it's the theme I always come back to in these situations, is it wasn't done by going cap in hand and asking for permission to do it. That's not how it happened, and that's never how it happens. Communities bring about change, particularly in relation to housing and planning issues, not by seeking permission, but by going ahead and doing it anyway, and then turning around to the government saying, well, it's already there, you're not going to bulldoze it, are you? Sometimes they do, but often they back down and don't do the bulldozing. So the underlying, most lawyers know this, it's a common refrain of lawyers, but it's always worked locally and for this movement, is that it really is better to beg forgiveness later than to seek permission first. Because, and I knew that as a kid with my parents, let alone dealing with the ridiculous planning system that we have and the ridiculous councils. So I think that's been one of the great things, and that's one of the great answers. So as we go forward and listen to both the history and the forward-looking proposals, whether it's land share communities, multiple occupancies, tiny homes, van lifing facilities, or indeed squatting, don't mention the word, these are the ways we go forward, and we seek forgiveness rather than permission. And it's interesting, just today is actually the 1 year anniversary of when the Pine Street squatters actually let the world, they were actually there a bit before that, but let the world know. So it's interesting, and I'll just finish up on talking about that. One of the cruelest things about homelessness in this society is we expect and demand that the homeless are invisible. We demand that they're silent. We demand that they hide, and we even effectively demand that they're ashamed of themselves. And what Pine Street did differently was said, we're here, we're proud, we're doing good things, we're protecting the houses, we're helping other homeless people, and it's a positive thing. And for a while, they seemed to be tolerated, but effectively the right wing saw that as an absolute poke in the eye. How dare you be homeless, how dare you be proud, and how dare you say you're doing something positive. But despite all of the fascist bullying, despite all of the sock puppets, right-wing sock puppets on social media, despite Chris Minns enacting his fantasy of driving his bulldozer and and bulldozing houses and so on, despite the ridiculous demolitions. It's very interesting, and despite the Supreme Court decision this week, it's at least something I think we owe some honouring to the Pine Street squatters to have actually been there for a year. That's actually quite an achievement. They're still there, we still don't know the answer, and they're not the last ones. As we know, if you create a housing crisis and a whole lot of empty houses, you are always going to get squatting. There was already squatting all over the Northern Rivers and Lismore. There still is, there still will be. Just next door to me, I've got the Joy Love Art Gallery with Jimmy Willing, which is a new, beautiful, again, positive, honest, open, constructive face for squatting. So we'll have to see how the powers deal with that one. It's interesting, I mean, for all of their hard work to go into the Supreme Court, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers, they've really achieved very little other than, you know, proving what we already knew, that the legal system will back the owner over the squatter. But they've still got the same job they had of trying to get people out, and even if they get them out of the houses they're targeting, they're going to be in other houses anyway. They haven't solved the problem. And the other problem we have is their desire to demolish perfectly good houses. They seem to have paused that, but we've got to keep the pressure on that one. Okay, thanks everyone. I just need to get my piece of paper out now. Because the rest of that I just made up on the spot, obviously. What's that? Oh, I have. I'm not even over time. Well done. Okay. Okay, well again, thanks to Mark for the welcome, much appreciated. So next we've got, of course, Carol Perry coming up. Not yet, I'm just configuring the people. So we've got Carol Perry, what's going wrong? I don't usually have this problem. With the talk, Creating Involvement, Harmony and Continuum in Community, and I do look forward to that. I remember at the SCU conference, you know, there was all the sort of the heady stuff, and then Carol was just such a wonderful kind of feminine perspective in there that just said, yes, but you've got to get along as well. And that's really important, and I think that's something we all learnt so much with MOs, is you can set up a structure, but then you've got to stop tearing each other apart, which is a really big journey for white Western people, I think, to try and relearn those tribal skills. And then, again, one of my favourite women of the area, Gay Longmuir, shared with Megan James from Tuntable Falls Cooperative, Living Your Truth and Standing Up for Change, which I look forward to seeing. And finally, Rob Doolan, who I just met, who's had a very long history. I think from what I hear chatting to him, that seeking forgiveness rather than permission stage of the multiple occupancy movement, working with government after the event, after people were already there and saying, all right, well, you're going to have to find a way to allow us to keep being here. So thanks very much for all that work over the years as well. So there are our three people. So I'll hand it over to Carol to get started.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all coming. It's just exciting to be in a movement where people are not having the banks own them and having a system standing on your neck and not allowing you to live your life in the fullest way because you're indebted to everything. That's how they stand on our necks. And so I'm going to talk about my particular experience and the community that I started and co-founded and involved in. I'm not in any way saying this is the model. You know, there's many, many models for community, but there's some components of our model that I think are fairly universal. So I'm not saying our community style is the answer in any way. I also just want to say how heartbroken I am and acknowledge what's going on down on the south coast, the loss of houses that's going on down there. And we fully know how ongoing that tragedy is, and Aidan's outlined how that keeps going. So what I'm going to talk about is creating involvement, harmony and continuum continuity in community. And land sharing and affordable housing and community, they're always put together, but they're actually separate systems. Because sharing land or housing does not automatically mean that it will become a bonded community. And that's a word that I've started using, that we know that just because you want to share land doesn't mean you're going to be getting on together, and it is generally called a community, but what I think is the most fulfilling way to live for people wanting belonging and to be valued and affirmed is a bonded community. So affordable housing is absolutely essential to maintain an equitable, healthy society. And in the early days, in the 70s, when I and my husband bought the land at Terania Creek, affordable housing was achieved through land sharing. And our land sharing farm, I'm part of what I call the old guard. As you can see, I'm pretty old. On our farm, there's a swathe of the old guard, and then there's newer and younger people coming along. We are now building a dwelling for the older people who don't want to leave the farm. None of our older people want to leave the farm because we are a bonded community. We're going to help them live in a place that's more compatible with age, because some of our houses are not that compatible with age. I think a lot of you might know that. But we are finding the business of building this dwelling, compared with what it was in the past, extremely unaffordable. And I think Aidan spoke a bit about this. And not easy. In those days, it was affordable and easy, and councils didn't put all sorts of obstacles and money and huge fees in your way. So we already have the land, and it's still unaffordable and not easy, because council regulations have expanded and tightened, and conditions of consent and fees and timelines for DAs have increased. And then, of course, there's the things we do have to pay attention to, as the fire and land stability and so on. Building materials have risen in costs. And one thing that I think is a big problem is that councils have not kept abreast of some of the developments in housing materials that make it much quicker and to build a house. I don't know whether they're expensive or not, but I think councils or state government or somebody or some universities need to be collating all the material on alternative building, information on alternative building materials, and making them available to the public, and also working out what their conditions of building consent are around those new materials, and doing a bit like a choice magazine, which ones, having a good study of which ones work and which ones don't, so that they are supporting all other options. But bureaucracies are consistently behind the times. And in the 70s, we had the Home Builders Association, which did lobby, and I think Gay and Megan will talk about that, but we had a very good lobby group. And they lobbied for using alternative materials, for getting composting toilets. We have no flush toilets. I think before we pulled down the Forest Meditation Centre, which was a loss to climate change, we had 11 or 12, I think 12 composting toilets on our farm, and they're a great resource for your fruit trees and so on. But even though housing is being mentioned as a problem, it seems to me they're not doing something to make it easier for people to do that. So whatever form affordable housing takes, whether it's rural land sharing, eco-village, urban housing cluster or purpose-built co-living, or any other constellation of people choosing to live together, until you're buried, it will not necessarily become a bonded community, and this is my big interest, unless you actually put the effort into it. And a bonded community to me is where people feel connected, valued, find meaning, inclusion, care and belonging in the collective activities. And the absence of these features in the normative mainstream life can lead to a huge sense of alienation. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people to this area, because to a large extent, this whole area is very communal. And so alienation will often bring people to the idea of intentional community in whatever form. And the cultivation of community is described as intentional. I think that's an interesting word. It's the name that's used for land sharing and living situations in this area and elsewhere. However, it seems to me that the concept of intentionality has been relegated simply to the land sharing systems and has not been widely applied to the realm of interpersonal relationships in those shared living situations. So skill development, anyone can learn how to use a chainsaw or a whippersnipper or actually build a house. It's not that hard to learn. But the things like effective decision-making, conflict resolution, bonding activities like sharing meals and celebrations needs to be intentional and ongoing if you want to have an ongoingly bonded community and relatively harmonious. Nothing's going to just be smooth sailing when humans are involved. It's always ups and downs, and it's always a lot of intentional work and not turning away from it. And it's very easy to turn away from it. So, and that's what's happened largely. And Peter Koch had the academic at Monash University who wrote a book about community decades ago. He said they devolved into, what did he call them? Suburb, anyway, I can't think of the name, I'm sorry. Rural suburbias, that was the name he gave to them. Where in a lot of suburban areas are not very connected. People are not very connected. So daily communication processes where members aim to manage their triggered states as they arise and claim and calm themselves and speak from a differentiated mind that knows thoughts generate feelings, feelings generate thoughts, and these belong to you, they don't belong to the other. It's quite hard, I think, for humans to realise that a thought that has arisen in your mind belongs to you. Even if it is a thought about somebody else or about a system or about anything, it belongs to you. And it's incredibly important to realise that and claim it and not export that onto the other person as though it belongs to them and that you are the last word on what sort of person they are. So this is quite a high level of interpersonal, reflecting on yourself. And the other part of that is that we're not always going to be able to manage our triggers, so we need to have a good relationship with repair processes and be willing to engage in those repair processes when unintentionally we have a hurtful communication. So it seems to me, and I've listened to a few, conferences on the internet during COVID of people globally talking about a lot of things, and communities was one of them. And it's none of them, when I talked about the intentionality on our community of paying big attention, making an absolute priority, the interpersonal communications, people were surprised. And it sounds, I'm surprised back, because how can you think that you can live with a lot of people when most of us have come out of families that yell at each other, that stop speaking, that slam doors, that walk away? How can you think that you're going to go from that, which was my experience of a family, into a community with lots of people and not do that? You know, I'm very surprised about that. So my community began to take shape in the mid-70s, and our aim was to repair the very damaged land, grow food, live low consumption lives, sharing resources, help each other build homes and other community facilities, and eat together and work together, and not have a mortgage, that no one should have a mortgage. And to this day, you will find us 45 years when we actually started to gather the people there. You will find us in the vegetable garden on a Saturday morning, so they're there now, this Saturday morning, working in the vegetable garden, which from a distance looks like a Pieter Bruegel painting. It is so beautiful to look down on it, and to the abundance, and to the people joyfully toiling in the garden and growing the food that gives us 70 to 80% of what we eat for up to 20 people. And that's across all food groups, because we are what I call an organic subsistence farm. And so all food groups. So those who cannot participate in that, being in the garden physically, they'll make morning tea, they'll be juicing fruit, producing pickles and other drying bananas and so on, preparing bananas for the dryer and so on. So I just want to say a bit more about intentionality. To get that picture, you need enormous amount of intentionality, enormous amount. So to me, I now call it a bonded community, but at the time I called it an extended family without the hierarchies. And so I made a fundamental choice at that time, and a fundamental choice as defined by Robert Fritz. It's a book from the 90s. He wrote a book called The Path of Least Resistance. So humans will always take the path of least resistance when things become unpleasant. So unpleasant conditions, the turning away from things, and pleasant conditions, it's very primitive. It's a very primitive brainstem response. I think we deserve more than that in our evolution. So a fundamental choice is something that keeps you on track regardless of external influences. Fundamental choices are supported then by primary and secondary choices. And often we get confused. We think we've made a fundamental choice when it is a primary choice, and a primary choice you can easily drop. So in the late 70s, our numbers increased and many decisions needed to be made. And of course, conflict escalates when there's quite major decisions about land use and things like that. And it was most unpleasant and most unsettling. And I thought I thought two things: either I leave this, it was very unpleasant, or I learn how to work with this. And I decided on the latter because I knew if I left, I'd end up in the mainstream alienation, because it took quite a lot to find this non-alienated way of living. So remarkably, in provincial Lismore at the time, there were quite a lot of resources for learning about interpersonal skills and conflict resolution and so on. And there was the TAFE in Lismore and the Conflict Resolution Network in Sydney. And so in our group there was unanimity about learning it together, so I would go to these courses and I'd bring the information back and we'd study it together, and then we'd implement it in our meetings and in our interactions in various ways. So we practiced over the years and we improved. We never got perfect because perfect is impossible. So we're not aiming for perfect, we're aiming for good enough, and our community is good enough. And it needs to be regarded as ongoing work. So each generation needs to start anew on it, because so we have now the youngest person on our place is holding meetings, and they're studying NVC, nonviolent communication, on the group and on the farm, and members of the farm go to it and people from off the farm go to it as well. So all groups, doesn't matter what sort of group, whether it's some living together sort of group or a team, a team that wants to get something done, a sports group, or fighting fires, or stopping gas fields, all those groups go through a forming, storming, norming and performing phases. And you need to have the skills to take yourself through those. And every time a new person joins the group, you go through those stages. And sometimes the storming phase can be big, and sometimes it's not so big, but the waves will all be different depending on the person. This is where you need that fundamental choice to create community, to hang in there. And an author called Robert Keegan, he wrote a book in 1994 entitled In Over Our Heads, The Mental Demands of Modern Life. And it identified 5 levels of conversation. And level 5, he says, is what is required for these times. Level 5 is a way of talking about something that is not oppositional. It is not absolutist and it is not oppositional. Level 4 is pretty much what the conflict resolution and NVCs teach, but level 5 is a level above that, and it's the most satisfying form of conversation, where I liken it to a Rubik's Cube. Where you're not trying to get all the faces to match, but you're just turning it and you're looking at the different constellations of colours, and you're examining those in all their subtlety, and then you turn it again, you look at the different constellations of colours. And I now put a Rubik's Cube on the middle of our table at meetings just to remind us of how absolutism absolutely flattens the landscape of nuance, and we have to have that nuance to be able to interact with each other in a way that is bonding and not crushing relationships. So it's level 5 communication is co-creative, living in a state of sympathetic friendliness, connected to universal values, but not being absolutist, connected to rights and responsibilities, integrative, flexible, and the flow, flexible flow way of being together, and holistic. So learning communication skills is the primary choice. So you've got the fundamental choice, you want bonded community. The fundamental choice is wanting bonded community. The primary choice, which supports the fundamental choice, is communication skills. And other ways of cultivating community, as I said, activities that people enjoy doing together. And the world of other creatures is incredible inspiration to me. And I always think of the bird, the bar-tailed godwit, which sets out with its companions from, you probably know this, from southwest Alaska. And it arrives in Auckland, I get all goosebumps when I say this. It arrives in Auckland 11 days later, having flown 12,200 kilometres over the Pacific Ocean with hardly any land in sight, and it does not stop flapping its wings. And it navigates through an internal system that is a mystery to scientists. That is the degree of focus on the fundamental choice that humans need to create a bonded community. I think the internal system for us is fundamental choice. That's a mystery to scientists. That fundamental choice is a mystery to scientists because it's profoundly creative. And whether your creativity is in the art or writing or sculpture or dancing or performance or drama, whatever your creative pursuit is, if you have not made a fundamental choice, it will not happen. And that is incredible mystery, I think, that power of choosing something and following it through. So our community is very small, and we all attend the weekly meetings and participate in decision making because we can all sit around a long table on the veranda, and those who, sorry, what am I saying? So there's no one in charge, there's no leader. However, groups of people, we run a very complex, a farm. We run a farm and a large piece of land which, all the internal systems we have to maintain, and looking after the land and caring for the a third of the land is in a conservation order so that we help, keep it weeded so that the natives can thrive and the forest can be really healthy. So various people are responsible for various activities in this giant jigsaw puzzle. And the thing is that everybody does their piece. They don't say they're going to do it and then not do it, they do it. And so that's how you get a lot of freedom when you know that someone's taking care of some aspect of something and you don't have to worry about it because you know that they are actually going to do it. So it is, and then if you want to have some input into an aspect that's not your aspect, then you consult that person. So it's a hierarchy of skill, not a hierarchy of position. And SBS came last year with their giant cameras and were nosing around looking for something that was suitable for a clickbait for TV because they wanted to do something on alternative ways of living, not, lots of alternative ways of living. And they were looking for the extraordinary. And sadly, that's the system they're stuck in because you need clickbait to get ratings and so on. I totally understand that they were stuck in a system in a box. And However, what I really, and they absolutely grilled the young people. They wouldn't talk to the old people. They grilled the young people, who is your leader? And it was good that they asked the young people, because young people are very, very sensitive to someone that's trying to control them. Aren't you? Yes. And the young people said, there isn't anyone trying to control us. But what I realised after they left, I knew that they wouldn't be using, because what's clickbait about a chook yard or a functioning vegetable garden? I don't know what they thought they were going to find, but the fact that we have run this place for all those years, that we produce all this food, that is what's extraordinary. And that is not a visual that you can put on national TV. So it really struck me what an extraordinary thing it is, that if you have a fundamental choice, this is what you can create something like this. So ours is an MO. There's no freehold title to the land or the house situated on it. And the members are directors of the Co-operative Limited, and we grant those, as members and directors, we grant de facto ownership to the house. So you can sell your house, but it can only be to an incoming member. And membership depends on the applicant's commitment to contributing to the management of the land, the infrastructure, the food growing, as well as commitment to cultivating peaceful relationships. And it's like a form of, I haven't got quite a word for it, but someone might provide such a word. I call it reverse income, because together our industriousness in raising the food and maintaining our own systems means that we have an incredible low cost of living. The cost of what it costs to live there per week is very, very low, and it has been for a long time. So we need people who come there to commit to that. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, there's plenty of other places to go to, and that is why it's good that we have a diversity of places, so people can find the place that is their cup of tea. And there's a range of activities you can choose from, so you can do what fits your skill set and your inclination. So in the vegetable garden, for example, people grow the crops that they feel connected to. And I grew carrots for decades, and someone's just taken that over because my physical capacity is reduced, is limited now, and someone just took it. And I went like that, and then I thought, no, what a relief. Yeah, I didn't have to, and then I said, shall I tell you, what I know about it? And he said yes, and yeah, and now he's doing it, and he's raised, it's very hard to raise carrots. They initiated carrots in Iran, and then they were little thin things, and then they made them into big juicy things. They do not like the wet, so he's managed to grow the carrots. In a book called Alienation and Charisma, it was written in the 1980s. It was a study of communal living by Benjamin Zablocki and a bunch of scientists. And it's suggested in that book that charisma can reside in a leader, and many communities flourish because they have a charismatic leader, and that leader is not if it's not an oppressive leader, those communities will flourish. But it also, charisma can also be a quality of the community itself. And that's something to reflect upon if you have made a fundamental choice to cultivate community. Charisma is like a strange attractor. That's a word used in chaos theory. A strange attractor, so they have attractors and strange attractors. Attractors in chaos theory are predictable. Strange attractors are unpredictable. So there's also a quality that you need of that people had to really come to terms with in the big community that happened over getting the gas company out of the Northern Rivers, and that big gas field free campaign that culminated in the Bentley camp, which was a massive community of people. And that you have to have a tolerance for things not going in a linear direction from here to here. And it's a tolerance of that chaos that happens in between this point and that point. And any people who couldn't tolerate that, one of my jobs was to talk to them and say, well, maybe this is not the sort of community that is the best place for you, because it's not that healthy to be that stressed about it. So Bentley, the Bentley camp was a flexible flow strange attractor, and the police kept saying it was the best place to bring people back to after they'd taken them away, because it was a village and it was a community, it was caring, it was supportive, and there was something meaningful to do. And that, in a way, is, and that was a short-term community. A longer term, but even in a short-term community, under those incredibly stressful conditions, that's what happened. That was a most powerful experience for the people who were in that camp. It was charismatic in that way, the community itself there. So in these times of environmental, massive upheaval we've got environmentally and geopolitically, we can't know what's going to happen climate-wise and politically and so on. And a few contemporary thinkers that I find very helpful have said that cultivating supportive community in whatever form you do it, whether it's a collective of art, artists sharing a studio, whatever form it comes in, is something that will be a buffer in the face of future difficulties. And we know what a buffer when the floods happened in Lismore, the community that formed there and responded to that flood. And when I went when I could get off the farm, when the roads, when I could get into town, and I started to volunteer with some of the groups there, with the, some of the groups there. There was a social worker there who told me her job was, she was a social worker who went around to all different disasters when they happened all over Australia. And she said to me, this is the best disaster I've ever been to, because of the level of community that you have here. And there are all these little hubs, helping people, feeding people, getting food out to people who are trapped and so on. And then think of Nimbin during the fires, how people came together here and so on. So this capacity that we have for flexible flow relationships, that's how Bentley was. That's how there was a cafe there called Trees Not Bombs. It was completely flexible flow. Obviously someone was making sure the food came in, very hidden in the background, but people came and they helped there, and it just was a flexible flow situation. Bentley was that, self-organising, consultative, supportive, innovative, resourceful, participative, caring, relational, inclusive, co-creative, enlivening. That's the charisma of community, ungraspable and potent. And that's the community that I live in as well. So thank you. I do questions?
Yes, if you wish to, you've got 9 minutes.
Yeah, so we've got 9 minutes to do questions. You'll ring the bell for me? Yeah. All right, if anyone has any questions. Yes. Oh, hi, Diana. Hello. Yes, that. I'll repeat it. So how have we kept it affordable for young people to come there and participate in the community? So we've got two. We have woofers all the time. That's a different thing. A lot of people have woofers, but a lot of our woofers, we've got one who's just not leaving.
Hello.
And we've got a woofer accommodation, so they can stay there. They can use the community kitchen and the community bathroom, the community laundry, and they've got a room in a bunkhouse with a private room in a building near those facilities. We've had a residency program for a long time where people can come for a year and live like the members do, not do a woofer a workload, but the same as the members. And we've got 2 places of accommodation for that, and people come, and sometimes they extend after that year, sometimes they leave, or sometimes they ask for membership. So they've got options at the end of that. At the moment, it's rather tricky because we're in a big transition phase where we've run out of how. Well, it's very expensive to build a house, and we've got people really come better if there's some accommodation to move into. No one really wants to grapple with this massive house building situation. And this accommodations for the older people will be available when we've built. When we're built, it should be the first bit of it. After 2.5 years, wait for council to approve it, and $30,000 down the Googler. When we've built that, the older people aren't quite ready to move out. Younger people can move in, and then when the older people. When the older people, there can just be a changing over. You know, they can take up the house of the older person who's moved out. So that's sort of how we're envisioning it, but it's taking a bit of time. We have to see it as a transition because all the rain we couldn't get a backhoe in to dig things as you do when you're building because of all the wet, and so it's taking longer than we would like. And the other thing is that because people built fairly big houses or had, using recycled material mostly, some of them have built granny flat type accommodations, so people can come and rent those, rent people's granny flats on the farm. That's another way that young people can come in. Yeah. Yes. Sorry? Yeah.
Quite often the price paid is in the several hundred thousands of dollars, even over $1 million on a multiple occupancy. I think you said that your members can sell their house to an incoming member.
Yep.
Do you find any abusive house prices that are impossible for the incoming members to meet?
No. So our houses aren't worth $1 million to start with. We wouldn't be selling. We don't interfere with what the price people put on them, but they're very, they're way under $1 million. Like the highest would be 200,000. If some of the more well-kept places and the ones that were built by builders, because we build a lot of our own houses. So there's a range of quality of houses there. But when we bought the land, my husband and me bought the land, We went away overseas for 2.5 years to earn the money to pay for it. And the idea was to consistently have low-cost housing. So the buy-in to our farm is only $25,000. But the thing about our place is that it is not everyone's cup of tea, because you're buying into committing yourself to farming. And slowly, we don't go out seeking anybody, but slowly, the right people come along. And that's how we've always lived for over, the 48 years or whatever that there's been some sort of community there. We have just waited till the right people come along, and they do. And we don't put it out anywhere that we need people, that they come along, and we have lived like that. And so the right people will come along. Yeah. But definitely no, our houses are not going to ever be, because the people who come there believe in what we believe in, to live like that, to live the way we do. You're not needing to be a millionaire. You don't need to be a millionaire because there's some inherently satisfying thing about living that way. Yeah. Yes.
Last question.
Yeah.
Where does a person who wants to put a house on a corner of someone's paddock find who has a spare corner of a paddock?
Oh. That's a risky thing, putting a house on the... I mean, if you want to, that's fine. I don't know how you find it out. People put it on social media, I've seen. But it's a dangerous thing, because I've heard of a lot of people allowing that to happen, and then something happens in their family and they have to sell it, and suddenly you're homeless again, and you've got no equity in the situation at all. So I think you have to listen to some of these other speakers here about other options that are not as precarious as just getting, building on the corner of someone's paddock. Yeah, okay.
Thanks very much, Carol. Let's have a second applause. Again, absolutely love that. I love the mention of the community itself being charismatic. When you first said it, there was that beautiful, what does she mean by that? What does she mean? And then when you used the Bentley example, I went, that's when it becomes collectively charismatic. It's so beautiful. And your mention of self-organisation, such an important thing. I mean, self-organisation was the Tinny Army, self-organisation was the recovery, self-organisation, is the MO movement. Self-organisation, rather than centralised organisation, is what really defines us. And it made me remember one of, Annie Kea's sort of statements during Bentley, as, it's not about having leadership, it's about tending to the health and fitness of the garden as it grows. And so I think, when we think of our communities as very similar to our gardens, we can take that approach. We've got to, tend to its health and fitness rather than think we're pulling the strings from above. So thanks again for a wonderful chat about the soft centre of the chocolate, really, which is the really hard part to do. All right, enough said. We'll bring on Gay now. And you, and Gay and Megan now. Megan, thank you very much.
Gay and I are going to speak for I think probably in your case maybe hundreds of people.
Scores.
Scores of people. I'm rather nervously speaking on behalf of probably thousands of people that have lived at Tuntable. So I'm very fortunate. I've had a look around, and the only people here that have lived at Tuntable know me quite well, so that's good. We agreed that we would start chronologically, which is the formation of the Coordination Co-operative at Tuntable Falls. After the Aquarius Festival, there was a meeting held here in this town hall. After Aquarius, what now? And while I wasn't there at that meeting, it's been reasonably well documented, and I can say for a fact that shares were sold at $200 each to buy a property that was a bit over 1,000 acres, and it was advertised by people travelling the country in the Nimbin caravan and going to the cities and to the Paddington market in Sydney and spreading the word through all kinds of alternative media that was around then. And ultimately the co-op was registered on the 19th of October 1973, and people moved on. The land wasn't fully paid for, but it was over the next few years, and people have been living there ever since. It's quite interesting to me in that the numbers of people at Tuntable have stayed very much the same over the whole of the last 53 years, and that's about 200 to 250 people. The faces have changed, but the numbers seem to be what that piece of land can happily support. In that time, we have learnt a huge amount, and I'm just going to read, hopefully it will come up, from our objects, which is our intentions. I personally wish we'd put a couple of other intentions in, but it's got a nice ring to it. The objects of the cooperative shall be to coordinate a community of persons living and working cooperatively on common property in a total creation environment of discovering, learning and perfecting modes of living, works of art, forms of communication, methods of awareness and skills of cultivation, craft and construction, and sharing responsibility for the quality of all life, which is fairly grandiose. So most of us have done our best. But it's been very interesting for me as somebody who moved there. I've actually bought a share I went there first in 1974 and I bought a share in 1975, as many other people did at the time, just to secure the land and to support the project. But I didn't live there until 1978 because it was actually pretty rough. Not just the physical living, but the social living. It was a frontier sort of project, a pioneer mentality, which meant that there were a lot of people with funny names. There was Compost Dave, there was Dave Poisoner, there was French John, you know, Black so-and-so, whatever. It had all the elements, I believe, of early colonial Australia. And that came with a bit of violence and insecurity. People that were attracted by the charisma of the notion of all those things also came in that generation from orphanages, highly dysfunctional families, people really looking for a way out from their alienation. Alienation was a term that was coined and in use a lot more now than it is currently. But it certainly drove lots of people out to the hills of Tuntable to find a better way and a place where they could live and find a home and a family. So I think it's something that needs to be remembered, but over the time that we have been there, over the 53 years, the place has certainly mellowed into much more of what Aidan was calling basically rural suburbia. However, that means that we don't have the violence, the accidental deaths aren't as common, people are much more comfortably housed. We are an institution now, which has good and bad points to it. That I could go on forever, but I will say that in the 1970s we were young. Most of the population there was, under 30 and fairly energetic, and once we started breeding, we got super energetic about making community, and my main contribution was with Caroline Lakuta and the assistance of Sonia Atkinson, to get the preschool started at Tuntable, and from that the primary school grew. And I personally believe that there was a lot of charisma in the parents working together there. And from those institutions we've also, and that I actually believe that the school and the primary school, the preschool and the primary school do have an ongoing charisma. We attract a lot of people in the area now. It's not just the people who live on Tuntable. And in 1979, we all got drawn into the Terrania protests just over the hill. And then in 1982, into the Mount Nardi protests, which led to a lot more inter-community connections. And I think I'll pass it over to Gay now to talk about Bodhi Farm and the differences and similarities we share.
Thanks, Megan. And it's a slightly nervy opportunity to speak here, and I just really want to appreciate particularly Jenny and Paul and other people in the background for creating this, because I think it's an extraordinarily timely thing for us to reflect on what we've created over these years. I thought I might just read, I've been at Bodhi Farm since, well, when we built the meditation, came and assisted building the meditation centre on Dhammananda. So in many ways, a lot of what I've got to say really builds on the shoulders of what Carol has shared. But I thought I might just introduce it just with a succinct little piece I probably wrote 20, 30 years ago about living in community, and then lead into some other things on this. Our community of about 20 adults and 18 children began in 1977 in a response to having shared the building of a simple forest retreat and some shared history of living in a meditation centre in India. It has been an experiment in attempting to live out our values of voluntary simplicity, to foster a spirit of inquiry, to protect the forest, and to live lightly on the earth. For me, contributing to the evolution of our community has been a rich gift, a kind of epic poem, creating a rainforest garden, liberating rocks, discovering my essential landscape, a sanctuary in my busy world. It is a source of joy and nurturance. Being in the magic and silence of the forest allows a time to integrate the demands and intensities of communal life and my work in the broader community. One of the special aspects of our community life has been the recreation of a village culture where there is freedom and safety to our children to explore the natural world and develop trusting relationships with a range of supportive human beings. And whilst a lot of things have moved on since then, I think there's a real essence in certainly what keeps me here, and maybe it's a little like something Carol mentioned before, but I was lucky enough to be in what we kind of dismissively call the India Club, where a number of us were living in Dalhousie, which is one of the hill stations in India, after doing some retreats with Christopher Titmus. And we had a community there that was supporting retreats. And because I know a lot of people here have sat retreats with Christopher over the years, and he very much has valued this area. But he came from the forest tradition in Thailand, had some relationship with Australia, and many of us came back. And in mid-1976, a lot of us came up to Dhammananda and helped this, I think, a very long-standing thing that Carol and Dudley had of wanting to create a Dharma centre there. It was just a very resourceful time. It was a time where actually we just assumed we had a lot of freedom and a lot of capacity to do things outside the square. And at the end of that year, at the end of 76, Christopher really encouraged us to live in community, and he and Mac and Subanna found some land literally down the road from the Forest Meditation Centre. And I guess I emphasise that because whilst, you know, there's lots of holes in all our cheese, you know, there's something about having that intention of what we were on about, and that idea that somehow if I have some problem with you, that I will take responsibility for my part of it. So, you know, that practice of self-inquiry, and we all know in ourselves or with other people that you can be a meditator for a long time and still be excellent at projecting your rage. But, you know, at least it's an invitation, and at least it's an encouragement for that. And I probably also emphasise it because in a way it was our Medita, who many of you will know, organised retreats for a long time up there, and lots of other people did, but it tended to be our immigration trail. So someone would come for a 10-day silent retreat, probably have their heart and mind blown and think, oh, what do I do now? And in fact, one very dear friend of mine she'd been married, but she was single and she was pregnant, came as a long-term visitor, someone who never had any intimate relationship with her, built a house for her, and, you know, like, in a way, who does that? You know, it was just a peculiar kind of time, and so much of our housing was being, you know, very few people, whether it was at the centre or Bodie Farm, knew very much about building. But there was, I mean, Ian Gayard, who a lot of you will know, built one of his homes, which was old packing cases from cars, and he whipped it up in a day or two and it became the kitty shed, you know. And so, but things got a little bit grander than that, but generally it was found materials, the beautiful timbers exactly like that are being slashed at the moment, but sawdust, cement, mud brick, and just being resourceful, finding wonderful old windows, that kind of capacity. But the other thing to say that, and again...
Yeah, I just have to throw in there that you guys had the best, you still have the best builder in this whole area.
As in Steve Stanford.
Steve Stanford. Because you don't hear much of Steve these days.
Well, you don't...
He is the absolute supreme craftsman in this area. He made the front doors, both sets.
Yeah.
And he's still there.
Well, thank you, because in fact Stephen is the unnamed builder of this house for my friend Julie, you know, so... and our extraordinary community building. And in terms of how times have changed, because I'm a bit of an archivist, I've got these extraordinary photos. Some of them are black and white photos. And Stephen, you know, who's very tall, I'm sure he's naked, perhaps he's got gumboots on, but milling timber for our community centre on a Harkin saw, you know, safety could have been a bit upped, but, you know, so, yeah, there's some wild times there. But I did also just want to acknowledge that we had an extraordinary number of children, and around the time of Terrania, when this the bottom has fallen out of the dairy industry, so land was very cheap. When we came, and, you know, I was 24, fresh from India, we thought $1,000 was a lot of money. And, you know, relatively it was, but we bought our land for 16 grand, and Subanna, who many of you know, her lovely mother, knew that a lot of people couldn't even afford that and put in a lot to help them in that, you know, so there was all these very elegant sort of supports. But while people were happy enough, maybe if there was trouble with the dairy industry, to sell land to, you know, clearly hippies, they didn't so much like the sorts of things that happened, particularly when Terrania was starting to happen. And around that time there were rumours that it was really baby farm, and they lured these women up to the meditation centre to do retreats, and then they'd go to the farm and they'd get impregnated, and it would get kind of worse when the children got sold. And, you know, probably without regard. But however, I sometimes feel, when I particularly look back, our peak population, I think vaguely around Terania times, was about nearly 30 adults. And actually it was kind of too many, I think, for that particular bit of land. But we had 12 children, 2 sets of twins within 6 weeks of each other. And when I look at our sort of vast, hairy, grinning faces, you know, like I just thought, yeah, you can have some compassion for the locals. They thought we were just plain weird. And there was that very, well, I think I've already said, implied that people didn't necessarily have a lot of building skills, but we were so collective. Like anyone who's got history with the place might remember the barn, which was this absolutely basic little building that was on the farm when we first got there. And we would make a main meal every day, perhaps except Sundays, and people would literally work together. So some people had good working skills, but there would be just that division of labour that was, I mean, in some ways incredibly empowering, because it was like, you can't do that? You can learn. And, you know, that was that kind of spirit. And even looking back at photos, on the little veranda we had a big, low round table, and all these 3- and 4-year-olds eating in this tiny little place. There's a room upstairs that someone lives in, so it was basic as. But I might be digressing with all of that.
Well, I think we could talk about the communal living stuff, because that was happening on Tuntable too in the early days. And people were sharing kitchens, building a shared kitchen and toilets and things like that, and having small buildings around, which brings us to some of the changes in the building code and the activism that led to that. From Terania and baby farms, there was a greater consciousness that hippies were up in the hills doing illegal things, and it became quite confrontational for Bodie Farm, to a lesser degree in a way for Tuntable, though Tuntable was a big threat. I mean, we were a lot of people, and a lot of them not wearing clothes a lot of the time. We were lucky in a way in that we were in Nimbin, and I have to say that we really need to give credit to the original white settlers here as well as the Aboriginal people, because on the whole, they were quite welcoming and tolerant. Not all, but on the whole, I think we were very, very blessed in that they were happy to share skills, to find us vaguely amusing rather than a threat, and to be glad that their town was being revived. Now, I'm not talking for all of them, but I personally have a great respect for the attitudes that we encountered here. Anyway, so it wasn't quite as confrontational here. But there was confrontation, and the council went to Bodie Farm. And they also did come to Tuntable, and we ended up giving an ICOSA to a preschool in Ganelabar rather than, and demolishing a house that was right next to the creek. Because in our original discussions with council, we were also very fortunate to have a fellow called Wally Duckering, who was the health inspector. And he was very flexible. He was keen to make sure that we were hygienic, which meant that which led to a rule that all our houses would be at least 50 metres from the main creek, if not from all water courses. I've written up, with the help of a lot of other people, a very comprehensive history of our building codes, and there are other photos and stuff from Tuntable that, if people want to look at lunchtime, I'll sit here with them. And that sort of goes into more detail about the chronology, which is it's been an ongoing thing. If you want to speak, do you want to speak about what happened at Bodie?
Yes, I would, yeah. So sort of in the backdrop of building houses, having all these marvellous little children about, we had, and I just was looking at some old clippings last night, so I got the sort of the dates in order, but we had some demolition orders that came to us in October 79. So this is all in the wake of Terrania, and I think, in a way, that's, I think, exactly what polarised things a whole lot more. I mean, and prior to Terrania, we had a lovely couple. In fact, we used to go and work on Wallace's pig farm, and Phyllis, who used to run the tea house in the Channon, would actually dry Rada and Stu's laundry, because they had twins and then another child. But then all those things started kind of ripping apart during Terrania, and you can see that in the marvellous film if you haven't given yourself the favour of that. But the early demolition orders were on, well, we had several on the farm, but one, many of you will know John Seed and Greta Seed. So their house was literally above where I now live, and it was subsequently an exploded house, but in that stage it was a mezzanine, it's quite steep country, and a small sleeping loft. And one of the things around these demolition orders, that if you call it 2 verandas back to back and a storage loft, we can approve this. And partly because, and I refer to John Seed as János from his Hungarian Jewish background, they were such an incredibly well-connected family. And through him, I'm sure it was Murray Wilcox, who was a QC, who came and acted on our behalf. I mean, we wouldn't have had tuppence for a QC, and in a way, I think we absolutely knew that we were in a powerful place to stand for the other people who were had less resources to do that. And I remember Murray speaking to council, and their QC is saying, oh, but a green, because Greta had a marvellous gardener who had a green wall, but a green wall, that would allow vermin. And him saying, really, Your Honour, some people's vermin is other people's wildlife. Yes, there might be snakes come through. Yes, in fact, we have goannas still kind of camping in the roofs, but it was just, in a way, that beautiful bit of speaking truth to power. You might want to call it a storage loft. We sleep with our precious son up in that little angled roof, you know, and we're not stupid people. We're not going to take risks that put our child and our lives at danger. So, you know, it was just a firm kind of like, hey, let's get a grip here about what matters. And when I was just looking through these old clippings, I saw again that Paul Lander, who of course was that magnificent environment minister who died way before his time, but he came up to check out Terrania, but he also talked with people, with council, about this whole MO, and I'm sure was very encouraging and supportive that they would actually support that.
And it wasn't just Bodie Farm.
Yeah.
By this time there were a lot of small communities in the area, and Home Builders Association was formed, and the Pan Community, I can't remember whether it was an association or what.
Pan Community Council.
Pan Community Council, which made a lobby group, which was fantastic, and shared ideas and activism. And in 1983, MOs were legislated by the New South Wales government, and Paul Lander was pretty influential in that too. And from that time, which was the 1980s, were definitely a time of sort of implementing and consolidating all the exciting changes we talked about in the 60s and 70s. From that time, in my opinion, the notion of multiple occupancies as in government legislation has sort of degenerated somewhat into being very regulated. And while I can understand on many levels that our environmental activism and the threat of climate change have led to far more environmental regulations, and I have to respect that, and also bushfire protection and a whole heap of things which are common sense, but they've made it much more difficult over the years, and particularly in the years, I think, of the 90s and the early 2000s. The regulations became more and more stringent, and houses that were like Aiden's and just sort of, you sent off your paperwork to council and it's sent back, and they sent it back rubber stamped and never bothered to come and look. That sort of got squelched by an oyster out, people getting poisoned by oysters in the Hawkesbury River, and there was a big fuss about grey water systems and toilets, and we had inspections of houses for those things. And since that time, and that was the early 2000s, early 2000s, the regulations have become more and more stringent. They do actually inspect our houses and the sites that they are built on. And I can see the sense in this too, because my house had a landslide either side of it 3 years ago, and I've finally gotten a decent geotech assessment which tells me what I strongly feel, that it's not really safe. I think it's probably good that we do have those inspections, but they cost money. They cost a lot of money, and the whole overseeing arch of government has become quite, not punitive, but definitely oppressive and difficult to work with. And for that reason, many of our younger people decided to build their house to regulation, but not to inform the council necessarily. And some years ago, some ratted on them to the council, and we've had inspections since to bring those houses to approve them. And fortunately, most of those houses were overbuilt rather than underbuilt, and are built to regulations. And we were very stringent on the co-op to make sure that people put the grey water plans and their toilet plans in, and that even if they built those first before they built their house. So now that we've had a whole process of people retrospectively getting their places approved. My son was in process of doing that, and now his huge 3-storey dance studio come residence come artwork come sculpture is now on the edge of a 100-metre precipice, and he's in the same position as me. So we have interesting decisions to make, and history goes on, and I may have to just take the government offer of demolition, though I have really resisted. I keep thinking they're going to bring a bulldozer in and just knock it down and chip it like the houses in Lisbon. They can't do that. I built my house myself, living in a tent with 2 little kids, and over the years with a lot of help. It's precious. Yeah. It is my little work of art. I'm lucky in that I've raised my kids and it's served the function that I built it for. And part of me is very happy to return it to the cedar trees that once grew there. But I'm a bit worried about my neighbour, because on Tuntable we don't necessarily have the good communication that we need for resolving conflict and for looking after the land. My neighbour will probably just let it go back to weeds, so I'm trying to figure out a plan to keep the cow cane and the Madeira vine out of all the trees that I've planted, the bush regen that I've done since the bushfires went right down to the back of my house, and all the bush regen that I've done on the landslide, where the trees are now growing on a bit of a lean, which is a bit upsetting. But they're there, and perhaps in 20 years my place, will be more stable. I don't know where I'll be though, with all these over-regulation stuff. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, back to the past or the evolving of the present.
I think it's probably quite good for us to bring up to the present day, because, the present day is actually quite important. But I also feel like, again, not wanting to tout us at all, because we've had conflicts and difficulties, but I just think sometimes when I hear people saying, for most understandable reasons, MOs are great because, it's a really cheap way to buy land. Worst reason. Yes, it makes sense, but actually really tending those relational skills is absolutely fundamental as the foundations of your building, as far as I'm concerned. And, at least having some sort of fallback position that if I get in a rage with you about where I've put my next tree or something, we might talk about it, and in Carol's suggestion, hopefully in at least a good moment, I'll own my own rage about the matter that you're being so oppositional, or, whatever it is. And I just think, in a way, in our culture, we're not especially educated for that, and that's not highly valued oftentimes. And I think one of the things, and in fact I'd hoped he might have even been here for this, but in a nice little bit of circularity, I also have a few photos that people might want to look at later, but in 1994 we had a big action at the Lismore City Council when they decided to not continue with MOs, and all our beautiful children, and there was the most fantastic quote from Chris Anderson, which I don't right have in front of me, but my own daughter Hannah was holding this big banner saying, MOs grow great kids. And I think we absolutely do, because if you're a strung out parent right now, not having energy, they might go and work with someone else or hang out with someone else, and that sort of, in a way, that broad brush. But I suppose the issue of renewal in community, and I think at least on our place where we've also had some very severe landslips, is a huge thing. I think it's objective to say that I think it's actually getting harder to be there as weather patterns change. But also, as Carol said, attracting particularly a family to come and be, well, they probably don't want to live for a few years in a tent while we decide whether or not we want to marry them or not, which is sort of a bit how it is in our community. And in the early 2000s, I went to Melbourne for a bit, and I ended up staying 8 years, and it was fabulous because I had a series of people living in my place, and one of them was a gorgeous little kid called Rio, who lived with his dad Jonathan, who some of you will know, and just now he has become a resident on our community. And in a nice moment of circularity, I'm his sponsor. So that just means I come and have a cup of tea with you, and if there's something that feels a little bit weird or there's something around the house that doesn't feel okay, because, look, in a way it's a whole other conversation, but there's all the issues of people for all manner of life reasons who don't continue to live there, but you don't want this house that you've loved to be trashed. But then it's not your major residence, and so your life has moved on, and there's all those sort of awkwardnesses, and I think we're in a real transitional phase with all of that. But just to go back, and I don't think he'll mind me mentioning his name, but Rio, who's now on the farm, was exactly one of the people who's lived for a lot of the past year in Pine Street. And in a way, all those sorts of issues are becoming so contemporary. And we've, I suppose there's something of the commitment of making it an accessible and very affordable kind of life. So in a way, you spend your dues by physically working what you can, and if you're too busy studying, then maybe I pay you to do some brush cutting for me or whatever it is. So, there's that kind of notion.
We've got 10 minutes left. I'm wondering who wants to ask questions. If you could just put your hands up so that I know how many there are, so we can... So don't ask the questions, just put your hand up if you think you've got a question. So I've got some idea, okay. Well, there's only 2, that's 3, okay. We could probably do that. Do you have much more to say?
No, just my poem.
Okay, all right, well, I'll keep talking for a little bit and then we'll go to the questions,
sure.
okay?
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention, which I think has really affected our community, apart from the lack of current, anyway, conflict resolution processes that are effective, is the increased regulation and administration load that's been brought on by computers in the last 25 years. That's been horrific, in my opinion. It takes more time, it costs more, it requires greater skills, it excludes people without those skills. It used to be that anybody could put their hand up to be a coordinator at Tuntable. Now you need at least good literacy and preferably computer skills, which makes it, it becomes more exclusive to get on the board of directors. The other thing I wanted to say, what was it? Oh, that'll do. That do? Do you want to read your poem now or later?
No, I want to read it now. There'll be
then we do
questions. There'll be questions later, and I'm just
questions after this.
yeah. I'm going to just be bold enough to share a poem that is true. It's a bit tangential, a bit like I am, and it's not exclusively about housing at all. But I do feel like it's an extraordinary commentary. Some of you will know Wendell Berry, a wonderful poet and farmer, I think from Kentucky. Anyway, American, and you know, that must already be hard. But in a way, it's so much around the times we're in with artificial intelligence, with all this kind of, in a way, very pernicious social control that I think is making it really hard for young people to really spread their wings in the way that we had the capacity to do. And just because it's not an often used word, it ends with practice insurrection. And I thought, I want to know what that means. And it literally means openly opposing authority. So it's quite dense, but I feel like for me it's an unofficial anthem. And my friend says, just read it, but it's true. Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. Love the quick profit, the annual raise, vacation with pay. Want more of everything ready-made. Be afraid to know your neighbours and to die. And you will have a window in your head. Not even your future will be a mystery anymore. Your mind will be punched in a card and shut away in a little drawer. When you want to buy something, they will call you. When they want you to die for profit, they will let you know. So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Work for nothing. Take all you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. Say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mould. Call that profit. Prophesy such returns. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Listen to carrion. Put your ear close and hear the faint chattering of the songs that are to come. Expect the end of the world. Laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. So long as women do not go cheap for power, please women more than men. Ask yourself, will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? Will this disturb the sleep of a woman near to giving birth? Go with your love to the fields. Lie down in the shade. Rest your head in her lap. Swear allegiance to what is nighest your thoughts. As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the one you didn't go. Be like the fox, who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Praise resurrection. Insurrection.
That's great, and it reminds me of Cory Booker's 25-hour filibuster, which he closed with a quote from somebody else, I can't remember their name, which was, "Make trouble, make good trouble." That's all we can do. Yeah. Okay, questions? We've got a couple of minutes. Who's got the microphone?
Here I do.
Okay, cool.
So, I live out on Avalon.
And can you speak to whoever you wish to answer? Or?
Well, my question's to all of you,
Okay.
actually. Does anyone know which title works best for communities? Like Avalon runs on a company title. Avalon runs on a company title. You've got Bill and Cliff's is strata title. Tuntable is
Cooperative.
cooperative. Do you know which one works better for community practice?
I can't answer that question, but I think we could discuss it at the end of the day, because I think it's totally relevant. And I would say that a cooperative model is good, but it seems to be moving to community title for the people that are organising multiple occupancies these days. Okay, so well, I think we should talk about that more at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Next question?
To both of you, I think housing, of course, is crucial for every age group. But if you look at the demography these days and what they call peak deaths coming, can you talk more about places where people who age can die peacefully, live peacefully? And I think Carol mentioned something, and Tuntable has a great initiative. But maybe also Gay could say something about it. What are we going to do in our community about the older people going to places when they get very old?
Shall I answer quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Well, at Tuntable, we've been totally bamboozled by bushfires, COVID, floods, and the fact that most people on the property now work off the property and require maintenance of their roads, which now takes 40% of our budget, which is insane, given that we originally started with a rule that you didn't drive on the property unless you had a load, and a load was building materials only. And we kept that up for quite a long time. But yeah, we have no plan. We talk about it, we have no plan. We could, if we had the finance. We've been really, really bamboozled by disasters, by climate change, by a changing demographic and a changing economy. Yeah. We have a house for people who are very, very ill. Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
We have facilities on Tuntable. We have a fire shed and very active fire group when needed. We have the hall, which I hope most people have had a look at. We have the healing centre as well as the schools, and we have a community centre, but we don't have a place for people to age in place happily and safely. And it's something that I've been aware of right from when I first moved there. We have no flat ground which is suitable for a village, a much more village thing. We have big, everybody wants to live in Turramurra, you know, with huge backyards and full of weeds. But anyway.
Yeah. I will just briefly say our place, and in a way it was the idea with multiple occupancies that you don't take up prime land, prime agricultural land, but it's very steep. And in our place, a lot of people's experience is as they get older, they go away. And maybe because I'm a bit of a mountain goat, I'm hoping not to do that, but I'm on a steep space. I've got a very dear friend at Dumananda who's still in situ, mind you, it's flatter, but at 93, so she's my go-to girl. But, you know, I think in a way the topography and one's physical, you know, psychic makeup and physical makeup is probably going to call that a lot, but for me, one of the things that pulls me is to be in an intentional community rather than outsourced in a sort of isolated little box that, you know, is the destiny of some people. And I just find that a very sad, you know, reflection on our culture. So I think thinking about other options is very important.
We've reached time. How many more questions are there? Okay. 1, 2, 3, you were the original questioners, so we'll start, if that's okay. Yeah.
Gay, I just wanted you to talk about the fact that 650 people turned up at the council when those houses were going to be bulldozed. I think it's really important to know that, because now, when we're facing the same thing happening again, with 62 houses on the list to be bulldozed right now, 52 probably have been, that we take heart from what happened with that, because it did end up with Hawke, even as Prime Minister, saying, we want to understand and help these people. It had that effect. Could you just talk about that a bit?
Yeah.
We're going to run out of time. That's it.
Well, I'll just briefly say thank you, Jenny, because when I look at these photos, and I do have some colour, and it was such a moment, and in fact, Chris's little quote that I just read this morning was something like, and he was 15 at the time, I don't understand why people who've never found this kind of beauty are so opposed to what this fabulous life that we've grown up in. And, you know, in a way, the children themselves were such apostles for this kind of life that they had. So maybe I'll just leave the images for people, because yeah, I've got my timekeeper friend, and yeah.
Satwa? Satwa? Yep.
Just a question for Gay, and I'd sort of address it to Carol a little bit too, but I don't think she's here.
Yeah.
Oh, she is, sorry. Do you think that the degree of intentionality required for Bodhi Farm and Dharmananda actually precludes a lot of young people a bit? Because I'll just say, I'm from Sitter Farm, and I've been in touch with your communities through Steve and Ray and heaps of people. We're almost next door. And we had a much more open setup at Sitter Farm, where you come and live for, or not to rent, well, we had renters for a start. You just came in to a working bee, a social event and a meeting, and hands up, yes. So we had a much more flow of people, and over the years, I would say much more young people. And I'm aware that young people function differently. And that sort of intentionality we've matured into and value, and they value it too, but they're in a different stage of their life. And I'm sort of aware that actually both your communities don't have a lot of young people, probably compared to us. And I would throw in we grew Rio up on our place, but we'll lend him to you because he's a lovely young guy. You can borrow him for a while. But Laura wants him back. But no, just generally, is that intentionality, is it too much?
Well, it's certainly something that we have conversations about. I mean, one of our beautiful young men I know rented a house at your place for quite